Welcome to the MacMillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Sara Brinegar, a visiting scholar who's at Yale as the Rice Fellow in the European Studies Council. Her research interests include the history of the Soviet Union, Imperial Russia, the late Ottoman Empire, and Imperial Germany. Today we'll talk with Professor Brinegar about the politics of oil in the formation of the Soviet Union. Welcome, Professor Brinegar.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Let's begin with an overview of your book project. Tell us about it.
Sure. So the book project is a revision of my dissertation. I'm titling it right now, Binding the Periphery, Oil and State Building in the Soviet Caucasus. And the project looks at the way that the Soviet government was dependent on oil and the way that that dependency sort of led to different policy outcomes and shaped the way that they were able to construct the state in this early period.
Okay.
And I do this sort of with the actual military intervention of the Red Army into Azerbaijan, which is the area that I focus on, and its capital Baku, which was the largest oil center in the Russian Empire. And I look at the way that they rebuild the industry and sort of the whole process that goes into this, sort of the politics that surround it, where you get money, where you get capital, where they get resources, and how this affects not just the military campaign, but also literally on the ground and in Baku and also in the capitals. And then I trace it through its role in foreign policy and the way that they try to use it to gain diplomatic ties and different foreign trade contracts, which is not very successful. And then they sort of pivot, and I look at this pivot to much more practical, on the ground collaborations with fixers and sort of other somewhat unsavory types, and also setting up oil companies and the way that they use these other means to establish ties. Okay.
And what led you to be interested in this particular topic?
Yeah, that is, like most things, has a bit of a roundabout story. I actually started getting interested in this topic first in Azerbaijan, and then in the oil. They sort of came separately. In 2003, so quite a while ago now, I was in Russia on a language study, and I went to Kazan, which is the capital of an autonomous republic within the Russian Federation, Tatarstan. And I went to a school play, and it was in Tatar. And I just thought, what is this? Or what is this other experience that is in Russia that I didn't know anything about? So I thought I really wanted to do a project on the Soviet experience from a non-Russian point of view. What was it like? How was this different or the same from what was happening with a much more familiar story? And I ended up doing that in my master's degree. I went and looked at the revolution, the Russian Revolution of 1917, from the vantage point of the Caucasus and from Azerbaijan, and decided to pursue that in my PhD. And during my language training for Azerbaijani, I was in Baku for a summer. This is several years later. And I just looked around and I saw oil everywhere. And I just thought, this is interesting. There's something going on here, because it wasn't just that there was oil. I knew there was oil. I knew it was an oil city, but it seemed to be embedded everywhere, and everything was sponsored by BP or another oil company. It was just really interesting. So I thought I would just sort of do some background reading and look it up and kind of then move on with the project that I had been working on. And that's not what happened at all. I realized that there wasn't a lot of information for me. There was almost nothing in English, and even on the 1920s, 1930s, there was just startlingly little even in Russian. So I thought, oh wow, this is something that I can work with. I can find out what's going on.
Okay, so you're obviously fluent in Russian.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I was going to say, so how did you do the methodology then?
Yeah, so it's pretty standard historical archival work.
Okay.
So I did a lot of work first in Azerbaijan, which was really great, where I got to work with the state oil company archives. And this is something that I realized is actually a big benefit of doing work in where everything is nationalized, because the company archives were also part of the state archives. So I got some really rich sources that are sometimes much more difficult to get from private companies. so did some work there, worked in the libraries, and then again went to Russia and did some more archival work there, and kind of went through their public libraries and hunted down some sources. And so it's really most of it's archival. There's also some newspapers and more popular accounts as well.
Okay. So what are some of your findings?
Well, I think the most basic one that sounds kind of obvious but actually wasn't is that oil was really important. There is a view that it wasn't important. In fact, the much of the secondary literature, especially the Soviet literature that I came across, is all saying that oil didn't matter, it wasn't important.
And why do you think that is?
I think that it wasn't important economically in the way that we tend to associate oil now, and we look at the oil curse and oil resources and all of these ways that oil money drives things. But I think that in this context, it wasn't the oil money. I think it was oil, first oil as a resource, which is really sort of literally just fueling the economy, fueling the Red Army, providing kerosene. Because it's a different kind of industry in 1920 than it is today. It's very different. The industry that we see today is much more like a post-World War II phenomenon. So at that time, Russia is still very poor, mostly dependent on kerosene and these kinds of things. So the big exports and sort of the big money makers would be more grain and these kinds of issues. So there's a fixation on that in the literature and not on oil. And I think that I found that oil actually, especially in this 1920, 1922, very early, very formative period, just has an outsized place in both domestic and foreign policy, but also beyond its use as a commodity. It's also its use in terms of trying to negotiate on the world stage, trying to set a place for this new radical state through reestablishing basic partnerships and business partnerships and things that had been severed during the war. That it was through these other channels that oil was very important, and remained so for quite a while after that time period. Okay,
so what was the role of oil in the formation of the Soviet Union?
Well, that is a big question, and it changes. I think in the beginning years, it's that role literally as a resource, as energy, oil as energy.
And just internally for the country. They weren't really exporting it anywhere at that point, or other parts of the Soviet Union they were shipping it to?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, it is important primarily as hard currency early on. So once the basic needs of the military are met, the military and actually the railroads, some of the Russian railroads were already running on oil products. Once those basic needs were met, then the remainder of that was sent abroad for hard currency. And then that hard currency is in turn invested into the economy. And in many ways it was used to rebuild the coal industry, which is an interesting dynamic and actually looked very counterintuitive. And a lot of people thought for a long time that this was evidence of Russian backwardness, right? The Soviets didn't understand the economy, they didn't understand how to use anything, but in fact they were trying to use the hard currency from things like oil in order to create a domestic market for coal, because the economy was shattered, the whole country was shattered, so it was using it in this way that was not immediately obvious to outsiders.
But why coal and not oil?
Coal is cheaper. It's much cheaper. It has a different kind of infrastructure. And I think the other big issue is that oil is very capital intensive. For one thing, the machinery is very expensive. The equipment is very expensive. It was going through a big technological boom at this time, and they didn't have access to or the means to get this new capital infrastructure, which is something that they do start doing. But also, they came to the conclusion that oil made the Soviet Union more vulnerable, that it was actually a liability. And it was a liability primarily because of where it was located. It's located right on the border region with Turkey and Iran. And at that time, the British were very active in that area, and they looked at it as making the borders much more insecure and much more vulnerable to foreign occupation, which had happened several times over the course of World War I.
All right, so ultimately, what do you conclude?
I ultimately conclude that there is a lot of work left to be done in this area. I think it's a really exciting area, and I think that there's room for a lot more work and a lot more scholars than just, would happily have some colleagues in this area. And that it is important. It is something that we need to go back in. We need to understand more of, because it explains a lot about the way that the economy is built at that time period, but also going into World War II, what sorts of challenges the Soviet Union faced and didn't face because of the way the industry had developed. And I think it also tells us a lot about the way that oil works outside of the capitalist system that we're in. We're sort of accustomed to this idea of oil and the oil curse, and I think there's a very different dynamic in the Soviet Union that really needs to be explored, because I think the story is a very different one.
Very good. Very interesting. Thank you very much for being here with us today.
Great, thank you.
For more information about Professor Brinegar and her work, please visit our website at macmillanreport.yale.edu. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the MacMillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty MacMillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale. Thank you very much.